There are 10 signs that you possess an extremely rare form of survivor's intelligence. In everyday life, you would hardly recognize it as intelligence. On calm days, you may seem distracted, put things off, or take forever to make trivial decisions. But as soon as something shifts, your thinking changes. An appointment gets cancelled, someone suddenly behaves differently, or a plan falls apart. And while others are still trying to understand what happened, your mind is already sorting out the new situation. Difficult experiences do not automatically make anyone smarter. Some abilities only become visible when security disappears. Sign 1. You notice changes before you can explain them. A good friend calls you. The conversation sounds normal. He talks about the weekend, complains about work, and even makes a joke. Still, something sticks with you. He speaks faster than usual, becomes brief when a certain topic comes up, and does not mention someone at all who he normally talks about constantly. 2 days later, he tells you there was a serious argument. For your brain, the argument itself had been invisible beforehand, but the deviations were not. It compared the current conversation with previous ones and registered that something no longer fit the familiar pattern. Those who notice changes earlier gain time. Others react only once a problem has become obvious. Your brain starts assessing the new conditions before that happens. Sign 2. You quickly recognize who you can rely on. A new colleague is friendly, helpful, and says about almost everything, "No problem, I'll take care of it." Then small things start happening. A promised file is missing, an agreement is suddenly remembered differently, and whenever something goes wrong, of course someone else was responsible. A few weeks later, an important task comes up where you need to rely on someone, and you would rather give it to another person. What matters less is how someone appears while everything is running smoothly. It only becomes interesting when something goes wrong. Who keeps their word then? Who takes responsibility? And who immediately looks for someone else to blame? Sign 3. You do not mourn a failed plan for long. You booked a hotel. The photos looked fantastic, and of course everything has already been paid for. Then you arrive, the room smells musty, the heating does not work, and next door it sounds as if someone is taking drum lessons at midnight. Many people stay anyway. After all, they have paid and do not like admitting that the decision was a bad one. You are more likely to ask, does this plan still work at all? If the answer is no, you can let it go more quickly. The fact that you have already paid does not make the room any better. While others are still trying to save the old plan, you have already stopped negotiating with a reality that no longer exists. Sign 4. Under real pressure, your thinking becomes clearer. You are standing in the kitchen when suddenly water starts running out from under the sink. The floor is getting wet, and of course nothing you need is where it should be right now. While someone else is wondering which towel can be sacrificed, your mind becomes calm. Turn off the water, move things off the floor, check the electricity, call the landlord or a plumber. The strange thing is that the same person needed 20 minutes an hour earlier to choose between 2 kinds of yogurt. For many people, stress makes thinking worse. For others, something peculiar happens under real pressure to act. Unimportant things suddenly disappear, and the order of the next steps becomes clear. Sign 5. Your memory stores warning signs, not just events. You can forget where your keys are and still remember years later the one sentence someone said shortly before a serious argument. Not because the sentence sounded important. At the time, it seemed completely ordinary. Only in retrospect did it gain meaning. These are exactly the kinds of warning signs that remain surprisingly persistent in some people's minds. An unusually quiet tone, a pause that lasts too long, or a certain look shortly before a situation shifted. That is different from simply having a good memory. The entire event is not necessarily what gets stored. What remains is the small detail that broke the pattern immediately beforehand. The next time a similar moment occurs, that signal is no longer meaningless. Sign 6. When everything is going well, you look for the catch. You receive good news. A job works out, someone is unexpectedly accommodating, or something goes much more easily than expected. Everything suggests that you should simply be happy. Still, a question immediately appears in the back of your mind. Where is the catch? From the outside, that looks pessimistic. In an unpredictable environment, however, exactly this skepticism may have been useful. What matters is not whether the catch actually exists. What stands out is how quickly your thinking starts looking for the next possible change, even in a good situation. Sign 7. You learn fastest when you need something immediately. You arrive in an unfamiliar city. Your connecting train is cancelled, your battery is at 9%, and your hotel is on the other side of the city. Before that, you had barely paid attention to public transportation. 10 minutes later, you know the lines, transfers, fare zones, and 3 terms you had never needed an hour earlier. Under normal circumstances, the same information would probably have passed you by. Now it sticks immediately, because every single piece of it has a concrete consequence. What is interesting is not just the speed. Urgency works less like motivation and more like a filter. What is unimportant falls away, and what is useful remains. Sign 8. You read the rules of a room very quickly. You enter a group where you do not know anyone. After a few minutes, you notice that the loudest person is not the one making the decisions. Someone else barely says anything, but as soon as they speak, everyone changes direction. At the same time, you notice who responds well to a direct sentence and with whom 10 polite detours only waste time. Such rooms have rules that are written nowhere. Those who recognize them quickly make fewer costly mistakes. You notice, for example, whom you can address directly, with whom you should phrase things more carefully, and whose approval really matters in the end. Sign 9. You see more possibilities in limited resources. 2 hours before an important presentation, a colleague drops out, several figures are missing, and the person who was supposed to create the graphics cannot be reached. At this point, you could first establish that the schedule is ruined and that at least 3 things are missing. Instead, you start rebuilding. An old presentation provides the right graphics, someone from another department knows the missing figures, and 2 slides that had seemed absolutely essential simply get removed. In the end, the presentation looks different from what was planned, but it works. You do not have more resources, you simply give what is still available a new function more quickly. A workable solution becomes more valuable than the perfect plan that can no longer be carried out. As soon as it works, the solution suddenly looks obvious. That is why this ability is easily underestimated. Sign 10. You always keep an exit open. In a restaurant, you often notice the exit before you have even ordered. The same way of thinking appears in places where there is no door. In a job, a relationship, or a plan you do not want to be completely dependent on. You are not constantly expecting failure. A situation only becomes uncomfortable when there is no second option. But it becomes especially interesting when nothing happens at all. No argument is developing, no plan is starting to fall apart, and no one suddenly behaves differently. In theory, this should be the most comfortable state of all, but for a mind that responds especially well to change, this calm can feel surprisingly unfamiliar. Because as soon as something changes, there is information. A different tone of voice, an unexpected reaction, or a plan that suddenly stops working immediately provides something that can be interpreted. Stability barely does that. It poses no urgent question, demands no quick decision, and provides no small deviations from which the next step can be derived. And this is where the most unusual side of this intelligence appears. Someone who is especially good at reading uncertainty does not automatically feel more comfortable in complete security. Not because chaos is needed, but because the very signals this kind of thinking normally responds to so quickly are suddenly missing. That is how a completely stable situation can actually feel more uncomfortable than a crisis. In a crisis, there is something to recognize, adjust, or solve. In calm, there is none of that. And then one uncomfortable question remains. What happens to a brain that has learned to always keep an exit open when it eventually arrives somewhere it no longer needs to leave?